4:15 in the morning. The Iranian missile batteries near Bushehr were already powered up and aligned for a coordinated launch. This was no routine training exercise, as the guidance packages on 16 Fateh-110 missiles were locked onto the exact coordinates of the main pier at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. Would the defensive shield of the United States Fifth Fleet hold against a massed flight of ballistic missiles launched from such a dangerously close proximity? The coastal air was heavy and still, smelling of the salty Gulf and the acrid scent of preheated solid rocket motors. 3 seconds later, the first missile erupted from its canister, a pillar of white fire that turned the dark hills into high-contrast silhouettes. 16 missiles followed in rapid succession, their rocket motors tearing through the quiet morning with a sound like 1,000 freight trains passing at once. The exhaust plumes created a massive wall of white smoke that obscured the limestone cliffs, glowing with the orange intensity of the departing warheads. Each missile carried a 500-kilogram high-explosive warhead, climbing steeply into the atmosphere, before pitching over to accelerate toward its terminal velocity of Mach 3. 40 miles away, inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer USS Mason, the air was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. The ship was moored at the primary pier in Bahrain, its ANSPY-1 radar systems operating in a low-power maintenance mode. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the rhythmic, piercing chirp of the electronic warfare suite. A petty officer second class stared at his console as 16 distinct thermal blooms appeared on the northern horizon, climbing out of the Iranian coastline at a rate of 2,000 meters per second. His voice was steady but urgent as he called out the contact to the tactical action officer. The officer did not hesitate, immediately recognizing that these were not slow-moving cruise missiles or aircraft, but ballistic threats on a direct trajectory for their current position. He slammed his hand onto the general quarters button, and the haunting two-tone alarm began to wail throughout the ship and across the entire naval base. Over the speakers, the command echoed that this was not a drill, and that all personnel were to seek immediate cover or report to battle stations. The sound of the alarm carried across the water to the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet, where the duty officers were already watching the same data feeds in a state of controlled shock. The calculated time to impact was exactly 180 seconds. On the pier, sailors who had been performing routine deck maintenance dropped their tools and began a desperate sprint for the reinforced concrete bunkers located 300 meters inland. The heavy thud of boots on steel and the frantic shouts of officers filled the air as the base transitioned from a state of peace to a state of total war in less than 1 minute. Above the base, the sky was still black, but the stars were beginning to be blotted out by the descending streaks of fire. The incoming missiles had reached their apogee and were now diving back through the atmosphere, their nose cones glowing white-hot from the friction of the air. The tracking systems on the USS Mason and the nearby cruiser USS Shiloh began to scream, as the computers struggled to achieve a firm lock on 16 separate targets, moving at over 3,000 kilometers per hour. Inside the Aegis Command Corps, the tactical action officer authorized the engagement. The ship shuddered as the first Mark 41 vertical launch system covers blew open, and a pair of Standard Missile 3 interceptors roared into the night. The heat from the launch washed over the deck, the white smoke of the American interceptors crossing paths with the orange glow of the Iranian attackers. It was a race against physics, as the defenders had less than 2 minutes to intercept 16 warheads that were already falling from the edge of space. The atmosphere on the base was one of terrifying anticipation. The smell of burning propellant from the outgoing interceptors mixed with the humid Gulf air, creating a chemical fog that hung over the water. Every man and woman on the base knew that if the shield failed, there was nowhere to hide. From a half-ton of high explosives falling at 3 times the speed of sound, the first interceptor met its target 10 miles above the water. A silent flash of white light that signaled the destruction of 1 Iranian warhead, but 15 more were still coming, and they were closing the distance at a rate of 1 mile every 2 seconds. 4:17 in the morning. The waters of the Persian Gulf were no longer dark, illuminated by the rhythmic, blinding flashes of outgoing interceptors from Destroyer Squadron 50. The cruiser CG-67, USS Shiloh, functioned as the primary air defense commander for the entire sector, its AN/SPY-1 radar arrays radiating at maximum power to track the incoming Iranian ballistic warheads. On the bridge of the cruiser, the vibration of the 4 massive gas turbine engines was overshadowed by the physical shock of the Mark 41 vertical launch system, firing in rapid 4-cell ripples. Each Standard Missile 3 left the deck with a deafening roar, a pillar of white-hot plasma that scorched the non-skid coating and filled the air with the sharp, metallic tang of burnt solid fuel. The Aegis combat system was operating in an automated engagement mode, a complex dance of algorithms designed to prioritize the most immediate threats. High above the atmosphere, the first wave of Standard Missile 3 interceptors reached their burnout point, the kinetic kill vehicles separating from the rocket boosters at speeds exceeding 10,000 kilometers per hour. These kill vehicles used infrared seekers to find the cold, dark shapes of the Iranian warheads against the blackness of space. At an altitude of 150 kilometers, the first successful intercept occurred. There was no sound in the vacuum, only a brilliant, silent expansion of white light as the kinetic energy of the collision pulverized the Iranian missile into a cloud of harmless, glittering dust. Below the high-altitude engagement, the destroyer, DDG-87, USS Mason, was working the medium-tier defense. The ship was heeled over 10 degrees as it maintained a high-speed station-keeping maneuver to clear its own smoke and keep its radar fields unobstructed. The tactical action officer watched the large-screen displays as the computer projected the impact points of the remaining missiles. 3 were aimed directly at the naval base's fuel farm, while another 4 were tracking toward the main, administrative buildings and the communications array. The officer authorized the launch of 12 Standard Missile 2 Block 4 interceptors, which screamed off the forward and aft decks in a continuous stream of fire. The Gulf air, normally thick with humidity and the smell of the sea, was now a chaotic environment of sonic booms and chemical exhaust. Sailors on the deck of a nearby support vessel shielded their eyes. From the glare of the launches, the heat from the missile plumes felt even at a distance of 500 meters. Every few seconds, the sky would light up with a secondary flash as an interceptor found its mark, the debris raining down into the water like falling stars. Out of the original 16 missiles, 9 had been confirmed destroyed by the long-range and mid-range tiers of the American defense. However, 7 warheads had survived the initial gauntlet and were now entering the terminal phase of their flight, diving at a 75-degree angle toward the heart of the base. Inside the base bunkers, the sound of the interceptions was a series of distant, muffled thuds that shook the sandbags and concrete walls. The air inside the shelters was hot and stale, filled with the heavy breathing of hundreds of batter, sailors and civilian contractors waiting for the inevitable impact. Those who could see through small observation slits watched as the white trails of the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles began to spiral upward from the ships at the pier. These were the last-ditch defensive measures, smaller and more agile missiles designed to hit targets only seconds before they struck their objectives. The radar on the USS Mason was now saturated with data. The 7 remaining targets were accelerating as they hit the denser air of the lower atmosphere, their heat signatures blooming into massive white circles on the infrared sensors. The computer system issued a final warning, a synthesized voice announcing the transition to terminal engagement. The ship's 5-inch gun rotated toward the north, and the 20mm close-in weapon systems began their high-speed tracking, the barrels spinning with a low mechanical whine. The coordination between the cruiser and the destroyer was seamless, a product of thousands of hours of simulated training. They were firing everything they had, emptying the missile cells that had been loaded for months in anticipation of this exact moment. The smoke from the launches was now so thick that it blotted out the sunrise, creating an artificial twilight over the harbor. Despite the perfection, of the Aegis system and the bravery of the crews. The sheer physics of 7 warheads falling at Mach 3 over a distance of only 40 miles created a window of time that was closing too fast. The final layer of the shield was about to be tested, and the cost of a single failure was measured in hundreds of American lives. 4:18 in the morning. The final 7 Iranian warheads entered the dense lower atmosphere, their airframes glowing a dull cherry red from the friction of Mach 3 travel. On the deck of the destroyer USS Mason, the Mark 15 Phalanx close-in weapon system began its high-speed traverse, the 6-barrel Gatling gun tracking the incoming heat signatures with mechanical precision. The air around the pier was suddenly shredded by the sound of the weapon firing, a continuous, chainsaw-like roar that spat out 75 rounds of tungsten penetrators every single second. White tracers streaked into the dark sky, creating a wall of metal designed to shred the incoming ballistic skin before impact. 2 of the warheads were caught in this curtain of steel, disintegrating into thousands of small fragments that hissed as they hit the water of the harbor. A 3rd warhead was clipped by an evolved Sea Sparrow missile only 500 meters above the surface, causing it to tumble wildly before detonating prematurely over the empty parking lots of the base. However, the sheer volume of the saturation attack had finally found the mathematical gap in the Aegis defense. 4 warheads remained intact, their guidance systems locked onto the high-value infrastructure of Naval Support Activity Bahrain. The first warhead struck the concrete edge of the main pier, less than 50 meters from the moored hull of the USS Mason. The 500-kilogram high-explosive charge detonated with a force that sent a pressure wave rippling through the water, lifting the 8,900-ton destroyer several inches out of its displacement. The concrete pier was instantly pulverized, sending chunks of stone weighing hundreds of kilograms flying through the air like shrapnel. A section of the pier, 60 meters long, simply vanished, replaced by a churning cauldron of white foam and black smoke. Seconds later, the 2nd and 3rd warheads impacted the 5th Fleet Command and Control Center, a reinforced 3-story building that served as the brain of American naval operations in the region. The first warhead punched through the roof and 2 reinforced concrete floors before detonating in the central server room. The blast wave blew out every window in the facility, sending glass and office equipment flying into the courtyard. The 2nd warhead followed almost instantly, striking the southern wing and causing a total structural collapse of the upper floors. A massive pillar of black smoke and pulverized drywall dust erupted into the air, visible for miles across the city of Manama. The final warhead found its mark at the primary fuel farm, located on the eastern edge of the base. It struck a 10,000-gallon tank of JP-5 aviation fuel, the kinetic energy alone sufficient to rupture the steel skin before the fuse ignited. A fireball 300 meters wide expanded into the sky, the heat so intense that it scorched the paint off vehicles parked 2 blocks away. The air was suddenly thick with the suffocating smell of burning kerosene and the heavy, black soot of a massive petroleum fire. Inside the command bunkers, the shocks were felt as a series of violent earthquakes that threw personnel against the walls and knocked the primary power grids offline. The emergency red lighting flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the officers. There was a moment of absolute, dead silence following the last impact, broken only by the distant, high-pitched ringing in the ears of those near the blast zones. Then, the sound of secondary explosions began as ammunition lockers and smaller fuel lines were touched by the spreading fires. On the deck of the USS Mason, the crew scrambled to assess the damage. The ship was still afloat, but the hull had been peppered by pier fragments, and the electronics mast was leaning at a precarious angle. The air was no longer cool. It was filled with the searing heat of the nearby fuel fire and the acrid, chemical sting of burnt high explosives. The professional discipline of the United States Navy was now the only thing standing between the initial disaster and a total loss of the facility. Medics began to emerge from the shelters, their white bags slung over their shoulders as they ran toward the rising wall of black smoke at the command center. 4:20 in the morning. The smoke over Naval Support Activity Bahrain was thick enough to blot out the stars, a heavy black curtain that smelled of burnt jet fuel, pulverized concrete, and the ozone of shorted electrical systems. The immediate silence following the impacts lasted only 5 seconds before it was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical wail of fire alarms and the urgent shouts of damage control parties. This was the start of the golden hour, the critical 60-minute window where the professional discipline of the United States Navy would determine how many lives could be pulled from the wreckage. On the deck of the destroyer USS Mason, the air was shimmering with the heat from the destroyed pier. The ship's commanding officer stood on the bridge wing, looking down at the jagged remains of the concrete walkway. The vessel was listing 5 degrees to the port side, the hull having taken the brunt of the overpressure from the first warhead. He did not waste a single second on shock. He ordered the immediate activation of the Repair 5 damage control locker. Within 2 minutes, 30 sailors in tan flash gear and self-contained breathing apparatus were on the deck, hauling heavy canvas hoses toward the charred remains of the gangway. The water from the ship's fire mains hissed as it hit the white-hot metal of the pier's remaining support structures, creating a blinding wall of steam that further obscured the visibility. 200 meters inland, at the ruins of the 5th Fleet Command and Control Center, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The southern wing of the recanded, 3-story building had been pancaked, leaving a tangle of rebar and gray dust where offices had stood minutes before. Hospital corpsmen, their white medical consider bags visible even in the dim emergency lighting, were the first to reach the perimeter. They moved with a practiced, robotic efficiency, setting up a primary triage station on the grass of the central courtyard. The air here was dry and choked with the fine powder of smashed drywall, making every breath a struggle for the survivors crawling from the lower levels. A team of 12 Navy Seabees from the Public Works Department arrived with heavy lifting equipment and hydraulic cutters. They began the delicate process of tunneling into the rubble of the server room, where 20 personnel had been on duty at the time of the strike. The sound of gas-powered saws cutting through steel was constant, a high-pitched scream that competed with the roaring fire at the fuel farm. Every few minutes, a shout of "all quiet" would go up, and the heavy machinery would shut down so the rescuers could listen for the scratching or tapping of those trapped beneath the slabs of reinforced concrete. At the eastern edge of the base, the fire at the fuel farm had become a tactical emergency. The 10,000-gallon tank of aviation fuel was still erupting in a massive pillar of orange flame, the heat so intense that the firefighting crews could not get within 50 meters without specialized proximity suits. The base fire department, supported by Bahraini civil defense units, began a massive application of aqueous film, forming foam. The white, chemical suds flowed across the asphalt like a slow-moving river, designed to smother the oxygen supply of the burning kerosene. The smell of the foam was sharp and soapy, a strange contrast to the heavy, iron-like scent of the blood and dust at the command center. By 4:45 in the morning, the first casualties were being stabilized. The medical teams worked under the glow of portable LED floodlights, their hands steady as they treated blast-induced trauma and severe burns. Despite the devastation, the chain of command remained intact. Radio communications were established using backup satellite terminals, and a clear picture of the losses began to emerge. 12 personnel were confirmed killed in action in the initial blast at the command center, with another 45 wounded. The USS Mason reported 3 sailors injured by flying debris, but the ship remained combat-capable, its primary radar and weapon systems still powered by the internal gas turbines. The professionalism of the United States military was on full display as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting a long, pale light over the destruction. There was no panic, only the grim, determined execution of procedures that had been practiced for decades. The sailors and Marines on the ground knew that the eyes of the world were now on Bahrain, and that the Iranian batteries that had launched the strike were almost certainly being tracked by American assets in the air. The transition from rescue to retaliation was already beginning in the minds of the staff officers at the temporary command post. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, but the underlying feeling was one of cold, focused anger. 4:55 in the morning. the USS Ronald Reagan was carving a massive white wake through the dark waters of the Arabian Sea, turning hard into the wind to begin flight operations. The carrier had been operating in a state of modified readiness for 72 hours. But the flash message from the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain had changed the mission from deterrence to active retaliation in exactly 60 seconds. Could the strike package reach the mobile Iranian launchers near Bushehr before they disappeared into the rugged coastal mountains? The air over the flight deck was heavy and humid, now sliced by the sharp, chemical bite of JP-5 aviation fuel and the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the 4 steam catapults. On the 4-acre flight deck, the scene was one of choreographed intensity under the glow of amber floodlights. Sailors in yellow, green, and red jerseys moved with practiced speed around the parked aircraft of Carrier Air Wing 5. The first 2 aircraft to displant taxi toward the catapults were EA-18 Gulf Growlers, the specialized electronic warfare platforms designed to blind the Iranian radar networks. Behind them, a line of 12 FA-18 Super Hornets, each carrying a full load of 4,000 kilograms of precision-guided ordnance, waited with their engines idling at a low, guttural roar. The vibration of the 2 engines on set, each fighter was felt through the steel of the deck, a constant trembling that signaled the raw power ready to be unleashed. The catapult officer, known as the shooter, checked the final weight settings for the first Growler. With a crisp, downward motion of his arm, he gave the signal. The steam catapult fired with a sound like a thunderclap, accelerating the 30,000-kilogram aircraft from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds. The Growler disappeared over the processed bow, its twin engines glowing with a brilliant blue-white light as the afterburners engaged, pushing the aircraft into the black morning sky. Within 10 minutes, 24 aircraft were airborne, forming into a massive strike package and climbing to an altitude of 9,000 meters as they headed north toward the Persian Gulf. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were silent, focused on the green and multicolored displays of their glass cockpits. The flight leader, a commander with 15 years of experience, checked his tactical data link. The coordinates for the Iranian missile batteries had been updated by a high-altitude drone that was currently circling 5,000 meters above the launch site. The Iranian forces were already attempting to move their mobile transporters, large 10-wheeled vehicles carrying the remaining Fateh-110 missiles, into a series of reinforced tunnels carved into the limestone cliffs. The strike package had less than 15 minutes before the targets would be protected by 30 meters of solid rock. As the American aircraft crossed the coast of Iran at Mach 1.2, the electronic warfare officers in the back seats of the Growlers began their work. They flooded the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile radars with powerful bursts of electromagnetic energy, creating false targets and white noise that rendered the enemy defensive systems blind. The air was now thick with invisible energy, a digital battle, being fought at the speed of light. The pilots of the Super Hornets could see the Iranian radar sites trying to achieve a lock, the warning tones in their headsets chirping sporadically before being silenced by the Growler's interference. The strike package reached the release point 20 miles offshore. The flight leader keyed his radio, authorizing the first phase of the engagement. The target was a primary radar installation that had managed to burn through the electronic noise. The trigger was squeezed. An AGM-88 HARM missile shrieked off the rail of the lead Super Hornet, a white column of fire, punching backward through the cold morning air as it accelerated toward the enemy signal. The heat from the rocket motor washed across the underside of the wing, the missile leaving a distinct, spiraling trail of white smoke that hung in the air for 3 full seconds. This was the first shot of the American response, the beginning of a coordinated effort to dismantle the infrastructure that had launched the strike on Bahrain. Below them, the Iranian coast was a jagged line of dark rock and sparse lights. The pilots could see the thermal signatures of the mobile launchers moving slowly along a narrow mountain road, their exhaust heat standing out clearly against the cool ground. The tension in the cockpits was absolute. The only sound the steady hiss of oxygen through the flight masks and the low hum of the avionics. They were now seconds away from the primary impact, the moment where the professional capability of the carrier strike group would meet the reality of the enemy's defenses on the ground. 5:05 in the morning. The Iranian coastline near Bushehr. The lead FA-18 Super Hornet, callsign Dragon 11, was already screaming into a 60-degree dive toward the jagged mountain pass. The pilot had a solid infrared lock-on. The 3 mobile missile launchers that had murdered 12 of his fellow sailors 45 minutes earlier. This was not a demonstration of force. It was the systematic elimination of a threat that was only 300 meters from disappearing into a reinforced mountain tunnel. The cockpit was filled with the steady, high-pitched tone of the air-to-ground radar, and the air smelled of pure oxygen, and the faint, metallic scent of the avionics cooling system. The strike package of 12 Super Hornets split into 3 divisions of 4 aircraft each, executing a coordinated pincer maneuver designed to trap the mobile batteries on the narrow coastal road. The Iranian defenders, realizing the electronic warfare from the Growlers had blinded their primary search radars, began to fire man-portable air defense systems from the ridges above the road. Streaks of white smoke rose from the rocks, arcing toward the American jets like angry fingers of light. The pilots did not flinch, deploying bundles of magnesium flares that blossomed behind the aircraft in a blinding, white-hot cascade, successfully seducing the heat-seeking missiles away from their engines. The flight leader reached the release point for his primary ordnance. The trigger was squeezed. An AGM-65 Maverick missile shrieked off the port rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the cold morning air as it accelerated to over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The physical shock of the launch rocked the aircraft, the heat blast from the rocket motor washing across the fuselage with a dull, heavy thud. The pilot could see the white trail of his weapon, cutting through the gray morning mist, a straight line of kinetic intent aimed directly at the lead transporter erector launcher. The warhead punched clean through the armored cab of the lead vehicle, detonating the 10-ton chassis from the inside out. The impact was absolute and violent. The 6-ton truck was lifted 3 meters off the asphalt, the frame twisting like a wire toy. As the high explosives shattered the engine block and the fuel cells, a fireball 200 meters wide erupted instantly, the orange light bleaching the surrounding cliffs to a pale white. The solid rocket motor of the Fateh-110 missile, still mounted on the back, ignited from the heat, causing the massive missile to corkscrew wildly into the side of the mountain, where it exploded in a secondary detonation that sent thousands of tons of rock and debris sliding onto the road. The driver of the second vehicle reacted with a frantic, desperate panic. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, attempting to ram his way through the burning wreckage of the lead truck to reach the safety of the tunnel. But the chassis was too heavy and the road too narrow. The massive 10-wheeled vehicle skidded, its tires screaming as they lost traction on the oil-slicked pavement. The guards stationed at the tunnel entrance began to run, their small arms fire uselessly peppering the sky as they dove for the cover of the drainage ditches. They were no longer a disciplined military unit. They were men caught in the path of a technological storm they could neither see nor stop. The second and third military aircraft followed the lead, releasing GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions. These 500-pound satellite-guided bombs fell silently through the air before their guidance fins snapped into position. They struck the remaining 2 launchers with mathematical precision, the dual explosions merging into a single, earth-shaking roar that cracked eardrums 2 miles away. The pressure wave from the blasts threw the running guards off their feet, slamming them into the rocky terrain. The mountain pass was suddenly transformed into a corridor of fire and twisted steel, the heat so intense that the asphalt began to liquefy and run into the gutters. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the battery, a dense, oily column that rose straight into the windless sky. The burning pieces of the launchers were still settling when the radio channels of the strike package went into a disciplined silence for exactly 3 seconds. The mission was accomplished. The mobile battery that had struck Bahrain no longer existed as a functional unit. The flight leader checked his fuel state and banked his aircraft toward the west, his wingman tucked tightly in formation. Behind them, the only sound was the crackle of burning rubber and the deep, guttural groan of cooling metal. 5:07 in the morning. The Iranian integrated air defense system across the southern coast was now fully awake, its radar signatures blooming like digital flowers on the tactical displays of the EA-18 Gulf Growlers. The destruction of the mobile launchers had been a surgical strike, but the extraction of the strike package would be a gauntlet of high-velocity fire. The air was thick with invisible, high-energy pulses, as the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries attempted to burn through the electronic noise of the American jamming pods. At a reinforced concrete site 5 miles north of the Bushehr harbor, an Iranian radar crew achieved a momentary track on the trailing edge of the American formation. The Iranian commander ordered a ripple fire of 4 missiles. The heavy canisters on the back of the transport vehicles swung toward the west, and with a series of thunderous cracks, the missiles were cold-launched into the air. 1 second later, their rocket motors ignited with a blinding white flash, accelerating the 4-meter-long weapons to Mach 4 in less than 6 seconds. The heat blast from the launches scorched the surrounding sand for 30 meters, and a massive cloud of gray smoke rolled across the defensive perimeter. The Iranian soldiers on the ground cheered as they watched the 4 streaks of fire arc toward the sea. Their infrared seekers locked onto the heat signatures of the American jet engines. Inside the cockpit of the trailing FA-18 Super Hornet, the pilot's helmet-mounted display flashed a crimson warning. The voice of Bitch and Betty, the aircraft's automated warning system, repeated the word missile in a calm, mechanical cadence. The pilot did not panic. He slammed the throttles forward into full afterburner, the twin engines dumping raw fuel into the exhaust to provide the thrust needed for a high-G defensive brake. He kicked the rudder hard and pulled the stick back, the aircraft groaning as it pulled 7 times the force of gravity. The white trails of the Iranian missiles were now visible to the naked eye, closing the 3-mile gap at terrifying speed. The pilot deployed a specialized towed decoy, a small device on a fiber optic cable that mimicked the radar return of a much larger aircraft. The lead HQ-9 missile took the bait. It adjusted its flight path by 3 degrees and detonated its 90-kilogram fragmentation warhead exactly 10 meters from the decoy. The explosion was a brilliant orange sphere that shredded the decoy into thousands of pieces of carbon fiber, but the Super Hornet remained untouched. The pilot continued his spiraling descent, his wingman following in a tight, protective weave that allowed them to share sensor data and jamming frequencies. The response from the American strike package was immediate and overwhelming. A pair of FA-18 Gulf Growlers, orbiting 10 miles offshore, identified the exact GPS coordinates of the HQ-9 radar that had initiated the launch. They did not wait for further orders. The electronic warfare officers in the back seats authorized a coordinated strike using AGM-88 HARM missiles. 2 missiles shrieked off the rails of the Growlers, their solid rocket motors punching through the morning mist with a high-pitched scream that could be heard even over the roar of the wind. The first HARM missile followed the Iranian radar signal straight to its source. It struck the parabolic dish of the tracking radar with a kinetic force of 2,000 kilometers per hour, the high-explosive warhead detonating inside the electronics trailer. The impact was catastrophic. The trailer exploded into 1 million pieces of twisted aluminum and melted circuitry, the fire instantly consuming the 3 technicians inside. The secondary explosion of the cooling systems sent a jagged piece of the radar dish flying 300 meters through the air, where it sliced through a nearby communications tower like a hot knife through butter. The second HARM missile struck the primary command bunker of the battery, its shaped charge warhead punching through 2 meters of reinforced earth and concrete. The internal explosion caused the roof to heave upward before collapsing back down, burying the command staff under tons of rubble. The Iranian defenders who had been cheering moments before were now running in a frantic, disorganized panic, their white uniforms stained with the black soot of the burning radar equipment. The air around the battery was no longer filled with the sound of orders. It was dominated by the roar of secondary fires and the hiss of ruptured hydraulic lines. By 5:15 in the morning, the Iranian air defense site was a silent, smoking crater. The radar signatures that had been threatening the strike package had vanished from the American displays. The flight leader for the Super Hornets checked his tactical screen and confirmed that the path to the sea was clear. The air over the coast was now a graveyard of expensive electronics and shattered steel, a testament to the lethality of the American suppression of enemy air defenses. The immediate aftermath was a haunting stillness, broken only by the distant, receding thunder of the American jet engines as they crossed back into international airspace. 6:15 in the morning. Sheikh Issa Air Base, Bahrain. 3 C-17 Globemaster, 3 transport aircraft were already on the tarmac, their massive 4-engine turbofans screaming as they prepared for a mission that was never supposed to happen. Could the Air Force medical teams stabilize 45 critically wounded sailors during the 6-hour flight to Germany, while the region remained on the brink of a general war? The humid air of the Persian Gulf hung heavy over the runway, smelling of burnt rubber and the high-octane exhaust of constant flight operations. To the north, the black smoke from the naval base in Bahrain was still visible against the pale orange of the rising sun. The interior of the lead C-17 had been transformed into a flying intensive care unit in less than 90 minutes. Members of the 86th Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron worked with robotic efficiency, securing rows of litter stanchions to the floor of the cavernous cargo hold. The air inside the aircraft was pressurized and cooled, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the flight line outside. Every station was equipped with advanced ventilators, cardiac monitors, and portable oxygen concentrators. The metallic clicking of medical equipment being locked into place was the only sound that competed with the low, subterranean thrum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. The first ambulance convoy arrived from Naval Support Activity Bahrain at 6:45. The vehicles moved in a disciplined line, their red lights flashing but their sirens silent to maintain a sense of calm. Navy hospital corpsmen and Air Force nurses coordinated the transfer of the most critical patients, many of whom were suffering from complex blast injuries and third-degree burns, sustained during the strike on the command center. Each patient was tracked by a digital manifest, their vital signs being uploaded in real time to the medical staff waiting at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The logistics of the air bridge were a masterpiece of military planning. To ensure the C-17 aircraft could make the 3,500-kilometer journey without delay, a pair of KC-135 Stratotankers were already orbiting over the eastern Mediterranean. These tankers would provide the fuel needed for the heavy transports to maintain maximum cruising speed, bypass restricted Iranian adjacent airspace, and reach the European theater in record time. The coordination involved 4 separate air traffic control centers and the diplomatic clearing of flight paths over 5 different nations, all executed while the combat operations in the Gulf were still active. At 7:15, the first Globemaster began its takeoff roll. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared at maximum thrust, pushing the 80,000-kilogram aircraft down the runway. The physical force of the acceleration was felt by every medic in the cargo hold, but they did not stop their work. 2 flight surgeons were already performing an emergency procedure on a sailor with a shrapnel wound to the femoral artery, their hands steady despite the vibration of the climbing aircraft. The smell of antiseptic and sterile gauze began to replace the scent of jet fuel as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 11,000 meters. The flight deck of the C-17 was a sanctuary of focused professionalism. The pilots monitored their secure satellite links, receiving constant updates on the tactical situation in the Persian Gulf. They were flying a direct corridor designed to keep them well clear of any potential retaliatory strikes from the Iranian mainland. The navigator adjusted the flight path by 3 degrees to avoid a developing thunderstorm over the northern Saudi desert, ensuring the smoothest possible ride for the surgical teams in the back. Every minute saved on this flight was a minute closer to the specialized trauma care available only at the massive medical complex in Germany. By 8:45 in the morning, the 2nd and 3rd aircraft were also airborne, creating a continuous chain of medical support stretching across the Middle East. The sheer scale of the operation required the consumption of over 200,000 liters of aviation fuel and the coordination of over 400 personnel across 3 continents. This was the silent backbone of American military power. The ability to not only strike with devastating force, but to provide world-class medical care to its personnel within hours of a catastrophic event. As the lead C-17 crossed into European airspace, the tension on the aircraft began to subtly shift. The medical monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, and the condition of all 45 sailors remained stable. The air bridge was holding. The logistics of the evacuation were proving to be as decisive as the missiles launched from the Ronald Reagan. On the ground at Ramstein Air Base, a fleet of 20 ambulances was already staged on the ramp, their engines idling as they waited for the first wheels to touch the tarmac. The professional circle of care was nearly complete, moving the survivors of the Bahrain strike from the field of battle to the safety of a modern hospital. 10 in the morning on the 13th of January, 2026. The Persian Gulf. The sun rose over a horizon still choked by the gray and black plumes of the cooling fires at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. For the survivors on the ground, the morning light revealed a landscape that had been fundamentally altered in less than 5 minutes of flight time. The primary pier at Mina Salman was a jagged ruin, with 65 meters of reinforced concrete collapsed into the harbor, leaving the twisted remains of a crane dangling over the water. The air was heavy with the smell of stagnant seawater and the lingering chemical stench of the fire-suppressant foam that covered the eastern fuel farm in a thick, white shroud. Preliminary battle damage assessment teams from the Naval Facilities Engineering Systems Command were already on the ground, moving through the rubble with laser scanners and digital mapping tools. The report was grim. The 5th Fleet Command and Control Center was a total loss, with 40% of the structural footprint reduced to a heap of pulverized masonry and exposed rebar. Intelligence officers estimated that 300,000 liters of JP-5 aviation fuel had been consumed in the initial fireball at the eastern farm, representing a 20% loss of the base's immediate tactical reserves. The loss of life was now confirmed at 14 personnel, with another 32 in critical condition at medical facilities across the region. However, the silence of the ruined base was soon broken by a low, rhythmic vibration that could be felt in the soles of the boots of every sailor on the pier. 50 miles to the south, the USS Gerald R. Ford was entering the central Persian Gulf, leading a wall of steel that stretched for 10 miles across the water. The world's largest aircraft carrier moved at 25 knots, its massive hull cutting through the green water with a white, foaming wake that signaled a shift in the regional balance of power. Escorting the carrier were the cruiser USS Gettysburg and 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the DDG-121, USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr. The arrival of Carrier Strike Group 12 was a calculated display of American resilience. As the Ford reached a position 20 miles off the coast of Bahrain, the flight deck became a hive of intense, professional activity. Using the advanced arresting gear and the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, the carrier began a high-speed cycle of combat air patrols. Within 20 minutes, 24 F-35 Charlie stealth fighters and FA-18 Super Hornets were airborne, creating a continuous protective canopy over the ruins of the naval base. The air above the Gulf was once again filled with the roar of American engines, a sound that signaled the end of the Iranian window of opportunity. Inside the carrier's flag bridge, Rear Admiral Paul Lanzalota reviewed the tactical data links connecting his strike group to the remaining assets in Bahrain. The coordinates for the new CAP defensive perimeter were established at 26 degrees, 12 minutes north, 50 degrees, 36 minutes east. The Admiral's orders were clear: establish a total maritime and air exclusion zone within a 50-mile radius of the base. Any Iranian surface vessel or aircraft crossing the line would be identified and engaged with immediate, overwhelming force. The reckoning had transitioned from a localized rescue operation to a theater-wide projection of dominance. On the ground in Bahrain, the sight of the fort on the horizon had a profound psychological effect on the exhausted crew of the USS Mason. The destroyer, still moored to the remaining section of the pier, began the process of replenishing its missile cells from a supply ship that had arrived under the carrier's protection. The smell of the air was changing, the acrid smoke of the morning being replaced by the familiar ozone-heavy scent of high-powered radar arrays and jet exhaust. The base was a ruin, but the mission had not changed. The arrival of the Ford meant that the United States Navy was not withdrawing. It was digging in. The damage assessment continued throughout the afternoon, with teams identifying which systems could be salvaged and which would require a total rebuild. Engineers estimated that the primary pier could be made functional for small craft operations within 72 hours, provided the security environment remained stable. The tactical reality was that, while Iran had achieved a significant blow against the base's infrastructure, they had failed to disable the fleet's ability to retaliate. With the fort on station, the Fifth Fleet now possessed more striking power than it had before the first missile was even launched. 72 hours after the first missile impacted the pier, the temporary headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet, the ruins of the original command center were now a silent, cordoned-off zone of gray rubble and twisted steel. But the mission of the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf had not skipped a single beat. The question was no longer whether the base could survive a strike, but how the regional security architecture would be permanently rewritten to ensure such an event never happened again. The air over Bahrain was clear and dry, the heavy black smoke of the fuel fires replaced by the shimmering heat haze of a desert afternoon and the distant, constant whine of jet engines. The final casualty report was read in a somber, private ceremony held on the flight deck of the USS Mason, which had moved to a secure anchorage 3 miles offshore. 14 names were etched into the official record of the engagement, their lives lost in the first seconds of the Iranian salvo. 45 others were now receiving specialized care at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, with 3 expected to return to duty within the month. The cost was severe, a physical reminder of the thin line between deterrence and active combat. Yet the professional resolve of the remaining 3,000 personnel on the base remained unshaken. Strategically, the Iranian strike had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of forcing an American withdrawal, the attack had triggered the most significant reinforcement of the Persian Gulf in over a decade. The USS Gerald R. Ford, with its air wing of over 75 aircraft, was now a permanent fixture in the Central Gulf, its presence supported by a rotating schedule of Aegis-equipped destroyers. These ships were now loaded with a higher density of Standard Missile 6 interceptors, providing a 360-degree defensive umbrella that extended from the coast of Kuwait to the Strait of Hormuz. The operational status of the Fifth Fleet was declared fully restored by the morning of the 16th of January. A temporary command and control node had been established within a hardened underground facility 3 miles inland, utilizing redundant satellite links and fiber optic arrays to coordinate the movements of 22 vessels across the theater. The engineering teams from the Seabees had completed a temporary bridge over the destroyed section of the pier, allowing for the resumption of fuel and ammunition transfers. The smell of the base had shifted once again, now dominated by the scent of fresh asphalt and the ozone of new electronic installations. The new security posture was defined by a policy of immediate, proportional response. The rules of engagement had been updated to allow for the preemptive targeting of any mobile missile battery that displayed a launch sequence thermal signature. This was supported by a constant 24-hour orbit of MQ-9 Reaper drones and high-altitude F-35 Lightning II fighters, ensuring that no Iranian asset could move along the coast without being tracked in real time. The digital battle space was now as crowded as the physical one, with American cyber warfare units maintaining a constant pressure on the Iranian command networks to disrupt any future coordinated salvos. Diplomatically, the fallout was equally decisive. The unprovoked nature of the strike on a sovereign base had solidified regional alliances, with several neighboring nations granting the United States expanded basing rights for long-range maritime patrol aircraft. The Bahraini government reaffirmed its commitment to the partnership, seeing the rapid American retaliation as a validation of the security guarantees provided by the United States. The air over the capital of Manama was filled with the sound of joint training exercises, a loud and clear message that the alliance had been tempered, not broken, by the fire of the previous days. As the sun set on the third day after the attack, the lights of the naval base flickered back to life. The emergency generators had been replaced by a stabilized power grid, and the rhythm of daily life, the changing of the guard, the briefing of flight crews, the loading of supplies resumed its steady, professional pace. The scars on the landscape remained, but they were being covered by the rapid progress of reconstruction. The sailors who had survived the 10 impact at Bushehr stood their watches with a new level of focus, their eyes scanning the northern horizon not with fear, but with the cold, calculated readiness of a force that had been tested and found capable. The final report, submitted to the Department of Defense, concluded that the defense of Bahrain had been a tactical success for the Aegis system, despite the 4 warheads that penetrated the shield. The performance of the USS Mason and the subsequent strike from the USS Ronald Reagan were cited as benchmarks for future carrier strike group operations in contested environments. The Persian Gulf remained a volatile corridor of global commerce, but the shield of the Fifth Fleet was now thicker, more resilient, and backed by the most advanced carrier strike group in history. The mission continued, the flags flying at full mast as the fleet prepared for the long, vigilant watch ahead.